Before we start, tell me where you are listening from in the comments. Maybe you are someone who has lost faith in humanity after watching people disappoint you repeatedly. Maybe you think that successful people never experience periods of deep cynicism about human nature and potential. Maybe you have never reached a point where you questioned whether human beings are fundamentally good or whether civilization is worth preserving and advancing. This conversation is for you. I want to tell you about the day I had given up on humanity completely, when everything I had once believed about human potential, kindness, and the possibility that people could work together to solve important problems had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, selfishness, and the apparent inability of our species to prioritize collective welfare over individual gain. This was not about business failures or public criticism or any of the external challenges that people associate with my public life. This was about something much deeper and more fundamental, losing faith in the possibility that humans were worth the effort I was putting into trying to improve their future, that consciousness and civilization represented progress worth preserving, and that individual acts of dedication and sacrifice could make any meaningful difference in the trajectory of human development. Today I want to share this story because I believe many people who work on difficult problems go through periods of profound disillusionment with humanity that they rarely discuss publicly, especially when their work depends on maintaining optimism about human potential and the possibility of positive change. Sometimes the most important discoveries about human nature happen not when you are looking for them, but when you've stopped believing that goodness and nobility exist in sufficient quantities to justify hope for our species' future. This experience taught me that signs of humanity's fundamental goodness can appear exactly when you need them most, often in forms so simple and unexpected that they could easily be overlooked by anyone who is not desperate enough to pay attention. It showed me that faith in humanity is not about ignoring human flaws and failures, but about recognizing the capacity for growth, sacrifice, and love that exists alongside our capacity for selfishness and destruction. The loss of my faith in humanity had been gradual, accumulating over months of watching people prioritize short-term personal interests over long-term collective welfare, observing the cruelty and indifference that humans could display toward each other, and experiencing betrayal by people I had trusted to care about purposes larger than their own advancement. It was November 14th, 2021, and I was driving alone through rural Colorado after a series of meetings with government officials and business leaders that had left me feeling more disillusioned about human nature than I had ever felt in my life. The conversations had revealed levels of short-sightedness, corruption, and willful ignorance about existential threats facing humanity. Tesla was facing resistance from established automotive companies that seemed more interested in protecting their market positions than in accelerating the transition to sustainable transportation. SpaceX was dealing with regulatory agencies that appeared to prioritize bureaucratic procedures over the urgency of making life multiplanetary before potential extinction events. I was surrounded by evidence that humans would rather preserve familiar systems that benefited them personally than support changes that could benefit humanity as a whole. But more than these professional frustrations, I was wrestling with a crisis of faith in human nature itself. I had reached a point where I could no longer convince myself that most people were capable of thinking beyond their immediate self-interest, that democratic institutions could address problems that required long-term thinking and sacrifice, or that individual efforts to improve humanity's future were anything more than futile gestures in the face of species-wide selfishness and stupidity. This loss of faith was particularly devastating because it undermined the sense of mission and purpose that had motivated me to work on problems like sustainable energy and space exploration. If humans were fundamentally selfish and short-sighted, then what was the point of trying to preserve and expand a civilization that seemed incapable of learning from its mistakes or prioritizing collective welfare over individual advantage? I had been raised with an optimistic view of human potential that had allowed me to maintain faith in the possibility of progress even when confronted with evidence of human cruelty and ignorance. But the combination of personal betrayals and exposure to institutional corruption had gradually eroded my ability to believe that humans were worth the effort required to solve the problems threatening their survival. The final blow to my faith had come 2 weeks earlier, when I learned that a philanthropic foundation I had supported for years had been systematically misusing donations intended for education and poverty relief, enriching administrators while providing minimal actual help to the people they claimed to serve. The betrayal represented everything I had come to believe about human nature. Even organizations supposedly dedicated to helping others were corrupted by self-interest and greed. As I drove through the empty Colorado countryside that November evening, I felt more hopeless about humanity than I had ever felt in my life. The beautiful landscape that should have inspired appreciation for what humans could preserve and protect instead seemed like evidence of what we would inevitably destroy through short-sightedness and indifference to consequences beyond our own lifetimes. I had stopped believing that humans were fundamentally different from other species driven primarily by survival instincts and competition for resources. The capacity for abstract thinking and long-term planning that I had once considered humanity's greatest advantages now seemed like evolutionary accidents that were insufficient to overcome deeper programming for selfishness and tribal conflict. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, something happened that forced me to question my certainty about the fundamental selfishness and hopelessness of human nature. I had been driving for over 2 hours without a specific destination, simply needing to be in motion and alone with my thoughts about whether my work on behalf of humanity was worth continuing. The road I was on was a winding mountain highway with very little traffic, cutting through forests and valleys that showed no signs of human habitation. As I rounded a sharp curve, I saw something ahead that made me slow down and eventually pull over completely. There, on the side of the mountain road, was a small crowd of people gathered around what appeared to be an overturned vehicle that had slid off the icy pavement and rolled down a steep embankment. But what struck me was not the accident itself, but what I observed as I watched the scene unfold. There were at least 12 people who had stopped their own journeys to help, including families with children who had gotten out of warm cars on a freezing evening to assist complete strangers who were in trouble. I watched as these people organized themselves spontaneously into an efficient rescue operation. Some were directing traffic around the accident site to prevent additional vehicles from sliding on the same patch of ice. Others were climbing down the dangerous embankment to check on the occupants of the overturned car. Several people were on their phones, calling for emergency services and providing detailed location information to dispatchers. But what moved me most was observing the care and coordination with which these strangers worked together. There was no arguing about who should do what, no jockeying for credit or leadership, no apparent concern about personal liability or inconvenience. Everyone simply saw people who needed help and responded with immediate, selfless action. I got out of my car and joined the group, asking how I could assist. Within minutes, I was part of a human chain passing emergency supplies down the embankment and helping to stabilize the injured driver until professional medical help could arrive. The family in the overturned vehicle included 2 young children who were frightened but not seriously hurt, and I watched as multiple strangers took turns comforting them while their parents received medical attention. The entire rescue operation took about 45 minutes, during which time I observed levels of cooperation, selflessness, and genuine care between complete strangers that directly contradicted everything I had been believing about human nature over the previous months. When the emergency responders arrived and took over the scene, the group of volunteer rescuers dispersed quietly, with most people leaving without exchanging names or contact information. They had stopped their own journeys, risked their own safety, and spent their own time helping people they had never met and would probably never see again. And they expected nothing in return except the knowledge that they had done the right thing. As I stood beside my car watching the last of the volunteers drive away, I felt something shift inside me that I had not experienced in months. These people had demonstrated that humans were capable of immediate, selfless action on behalf of others, even when that action required personal sacrifice and offered no personal benefit. The accident scene had revealed aspects of human nature that I had stopped believing existed. The instinctive response to help others in need, the ability to cooperate effectively with strangers, the willingness to take risks and accept inconvenience for the welfare of people outside their own families and social groups. What made this encounter particularly meaningful was how it directly addressed my crisis of faith in humanity. I had been convinced that humans were fundamentally selfish and incapable of prioritizing collective welfare over individual advantage. But this simple roadside emergency had shown me ordinary people demonstrating exactly the opposite qualities: selflessness, cooperation, and immediate concern for strangers' welfare. The timing and circumstances of witnessing this scene also seemed significant in ways that exceeded coincidence. I had been driving aimlessly through empty mountains, questioning whether humans were worth the effort I was putting into trying to improve their future, when I encountered a perfect demonstration of the qualities that made humanity worth preserving and advancing. I sat in my car for nearly an hour after the scene cleared, thinking about what I had witnessed and what it suggested about human nature and potential. The rescue operation had been spontaneous, efficient, and completely selfless, involving people from different backgrounds and age groups who had worked together seamlessly despite having no prior relationship or communication. The families who had stopped to help included people who were obviously traveling with their own children and who had legitimate reasons to prioritize their own safety and convenience over helping strangers. But when they encountered people in need, their immediate response had been to help, regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. The coordination and effectiveness of the rescue effort suggested that humans possessed natural capacities for cooperation and problem-solving that could be activated instantly when circumstances required them. These people had not needed training, leadership, or incentives to organize an effective response to an emergency. They had simply seen a problem that needed solving and had worked together to solve it. Most importantly, their behavior had been driven by empathy and care rather than calculation or self-interest. They had helped because helping was the right thing to do, not because they expected recognition, reward, or reciprocal assistance in the future. Standing on that mountain road, I began to reconsider my conclusions about human nature and the possibility that individual efforts to improve humanity's future could make meaningful differences. If ordinary people were capable of immediate, selfless action when confronted with clear needs, then perhaps the cynicism and selfishness I had been observing in institutional settings was not representative of fundamental human nature, but of corrupted systems that discouraged rather than encouraged people's better impulses. The accident scene had shown me humans acting according to their best instincts rather than their worst, and their behavior suggested that the capacity for cooperation, sacrifice, and care was as fundamental to human nature as the capacity for selfishness and competition that I had been focusing on. As I drove back toward civilization, I found myself thinking differently about the challenges I was facing with Tesla and SpaceX. Instead of seeing resistance and bureaucratic obstacles as evidence of irredeemable human stupidity, I began to see them as problems that could be solved by appealing to the same cooperative instincts that I had witnessed at the accident scene. The people who had helped that evening had demonstrated that humans could organize quickly and effectively to solve problems when they understood what needed to be done and why it mattered. Perhaps the challenge was not that humans were incapable of cooperation and long-term thinking, but that the importance and urgency of problems like climate change and existential risk were not being communicated in ways that activated people's natural helping responses. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning mentally to the scene I had witnessed on that mountain road. The image became a kind of touchstone that helped me maintain faith in human potential during periods when institutional failures and personal disappointments made it tempting to return to cynicism about our species' prospects. I also found myself paying attention to other examples of spontaneous human cooperation and kindness that I had previously overlooked or dismissed as exceptional rather than representative. News stories about disaster relief efforts, community responses to local emergencies, and individual acts of sacrifice for strangers began to seem like evidence of fundamental human goodness rather than rare exceptions to general selfishness. This renewed faith in humanity did not require ignoring human flaws, institutional corruption, or the real challenges facing our species. Instead, it involved recognizing that humans possessed capacities for both selfishness and cooperation, and that the challenge was creating conditions that encouraged their better instincts rather than their worse ones. 6 months after witnessing the accident scene, I began approaching my work on sustainable transportation and space exploration with renewed sense of purpose based on faith in human potential rather than obligation to preserve a species I had stopped believing was worth preserving. The roadside rescue had not answered all my questions about human nature, or eliminated my concerns about institutional failures and short-sighted decision-making. But it had restored my willingness to believe that humans were capable of growth, cooperation, and sacrifice when they understood what was at stake and what was required of them. The sign that restored my faith in humanity was not a dramatic gesture or heroic action, but a simple demonstration of ordinary people responding to clear need with immediate, selfless help. Sometimes the most important evidence of human goodness comes not from exceptional individuals or extraordinary circumstances, but from regular people acting according to their best instincts when confronted with opportunities to help others. The 12 strangers who stopped to help at that accident scene became symbols for me of humanity's potential for cooperation and care. Their behavior represented what humans could accomplish when they worked together effectively, and their immediate response to others' needs demonstrated the empathy and solidarity that made our species worth the effort required to ensure its survival and advancement. The loss of faith in humanity that I had experienced was real and probably necessary. It had forced me to confront evidence of human selfishness and institutional failure that needed to be acknowledged rather than ignored. But the restoration of faith that came through witnessing spontaneous human cooperation taught me that cynicism about human nature was as one-sided and incomplete as naive optimism about human perfection. If you are someone who has lost faith in humanity after experiencing betrayal, witnessing cruelty, or observing the apparent inability of people to cooperate on important problems, I want you to know that disillusionment with human behavior is often a necessary stage in developing a more realistic and mature understanding of human potential. The evidence of human goodness you need may not come in the forms you expect or at the times you think you need it. But if you remain open to the possibility that people are capable of growth, cooperation, and sacrifice when circumstances activate their better instincts, you may discover capacities for human goodness that exceed what cynical analysis alone can reveal. Sometimes the most important signs of human potential appear in the most ordinary circumstances, and sometimes the restoration of faith in humanity begins with simple demonstrations of people helping other people because helping is the right thing to do. Sometimes consciousness, trying to understand itself, means recognizing that humans possess capacities for both selfishness and cooperation, and that the future of our species depends on creating conditions that encourage our capacity for working together to solve problems that serve everyone's long-term welfare. Share this with someone who might be struggling with faith in human nature and the possibility that people can cooperate to solve important problems. Subscribe if these conversations help you think about human potential, cooperation, and the relationship between individual actions and collective progress. And remember, human nature includes both the capacity for selfishness and the capacity for cooperation. What example of spontaneous human cooperation or kindness might you have overlooked because you had stopped believing that such goodness was representative of human potential?